Guys, I have a bunch of totally new fantasy species to tell you about. We've got the brutal tribal Orcs, the graceful, elegant Belves, and the sturdy, ingenious Bwarves. Nobody has ever seen anything like them before, I promise. So today we're going to be talking about fantasy species and races and how they have become not nearly as unique as my flawless and wonderful Borks over time. Now, as you may well have guessed, non-human fantasy species have been a part of fantasy, or really human storytelling, essentially for all of human existence. So we as a species have quite a backlog of ideas to pull from. Many, though not all, of our common fantasy counterparts, especially elves, dwarves, goblins, and the like, are in some way descendants of old fairy tales. This is the basic background reason we see the same things so much, though as you might have guessed, Tolkien's works and D&D only reinforce these tropes. This video will not be complaining about this phenomenon, but instead talking about where people go right and go wrong with the common archetypes of fantasy and sci-fi non-human races. But to introduce our structure for this video, there are only 4 types of non-human species in fantasy media. The first is a slightly adjusted copy of elf, dwarf, or other human adjacent species. The second is animal person, the third is alien, and the fourth is construct. I'm stupid, so there's probably something that falls outside this paradigm, but I'd say 99% of everything you see can be boiled down to one of these 4 in some way or another. Each of them have their appeals, each has their downsides and overdone tropes, and we're going to try and cover them. But we're going to start with part 1, Belves, Bwarves, and Boblins. The most prolific, or if the term is applicable, successful fantasy races are usually those that are really quite close to being like humans, but with a few distinct things changed about them. Elves are like humans, but they live a really long time and are more magically attuned. Arrogance, agility, and all that are pretty common with elves, but I think the magical connection is a real uniting factor, as well as the long lives. Dwarves are like humans, except they're short, live in the mountains, and really like making things. Goblins are like humans, except they're small, almost universally troublesome, and have at least one exaggerated facial feature. If you stop and think about it for more than a second, it does become fairly obvious why these kinds of fantasy races are the most common, though there are really 2 parts to it. Relatability and believability. Relatability because audiences generally want characters they can understand on at least some level, and a sentient insect creature, for example, is not going to score as highly as a hot person with big ears. Believability is next because it is easy to buy something that looks and acts like a human doing human things. Having a zebra person requires some level of justification as to why specifically zebras get to be people and horses don't. Not to mention the fact that we intuitively know zebras to be dumber than people, most people at least. You can argue that these are stupid reasons for more human-like races to be more common, and I think that'd be fair, but they are the reasons. In any case, the trick with these, especially in seeing other people have their own takes on them, is that they do one of 2 things. They stick completely to existing tropes but refuse to play into it. That's to say, if I were being completely for real about saying my Borks are actually for real, totally different and unique, and the other way that they tend to get messed up is by the creator just making humans with a slight aesthetic change and not much else. Oh, these are my Bumans, they are inventive and creative, but also infight a lot and can be pretty hot-headed. Those are just people. Once again, you can do that. You could even make it a point to make all of your different fantasy races essentially all be like people and only be aesthetic differences. You could make a point out of that. But it requires self-awareness that that's what you're doing and making a deliberate effort to show that they're like humans, as opposed to trying to portray them as being different when they don't actually come off that way. But one of the main reasons that a lot of human-like fantasy races always end up being like dwarves or goblins or elves or whatever is just because it's difficult to come up with other archetypes that are close to human but aren't like the ones we already have. Each of those ones we already have is representative of an entire pre-modern concept of existence, so they're kind of hard to get away from. Any magical race that is kind of close to human is going to be compared to elves. Any mountain dwellers that make any note at all about their ability to mine, because, you know, they're in the mountains where you would like to mine, are going to be compared to dwarves. Any barbarian type is going to get compared to an orc. It's very hard to pull away from those established tropes because they're very broad and very pervasive. That isn't to say you can't make fresh archetypes and you can't make fresh races, but it is challenging because we've been talking about these types of creatures ever since we've had language and stories, more or less. But even looking around just a bit will show you where people have broken out from these archetypes. Zelda might have the basically elf Hylians, but I've never really seen anything like a Goron anywhere else. So if you end up with something that fits the elf mold, for example, I say it might work to just play into it. These archetypes are popular for a reason. And if you do come up with something that seems to be totally new, cherish it, but don't continue to make it different just for difference's sake. Now, world building your fantasy races is one of a number of things that can be hard to keep track of. You might have a couple dozen of them, depending on the size of your world, alongside dozens of countries and names and magic systems and what have you. So if you want a place that might help you keep all of that in line, our sponsor for today's video, World Anvil, might have a solution for you. Writing projects get big fast. You've got a lot of characters, you've got your plot lines, you've got a lot of locations. It's a lot to keep in one place, and none of us are very good at keeping it all together. However, World Anvil might just have a good solution for those woes. It's got a ready-made template and format for all your writing and world-building needs, making it easy to get all your information down and keep it in proper order. Need templates to keep track of character information? World Anvil's got it. Need an interactive map so you can develop the unique personality of each country, town, and village? World Anvil can do that. Need templates for magic systems? Once again, World Anvil has come prepared. Even timelines feature as something World Anvil can help you organize. And let me tell you, the histories of fantasy worlds get very detailed, and having a visual indicator to keep it all straight can be invaluable. All put together, it can really get you that wiki vibe where all your world building is part of a solid ecosystem, where you can jump from one topic to the next with ease and add to any given subtopic as needed. So if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% discount off any yearly membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. Once again, that's code JBAT for a 51% off on the annual plan. Thank you to World Anvil for sponsoring this video, and thank you for not skipping the ad. But after them, we have part 2, Animal People. Animal people are easily the second most common type of fantasy race, and there's usually at least one in any big fantasy universe. The Elder Scrolls has the Khajiit and the Argonians, Warhammer Fantasy has the Lizardmen, Beastmen, and the Skaven, and Zelda has the Rito and the Zora, and on and on. Animals are great fodder for fantasy races because they are very easy to make fit into a certain idea. Pretty much every animal has a mythological quality or a sort of personality to some culture out there somewhere. And those qualities and personalities people have given them are a wonderful place to start for making animal people. If you're making owl people, they're probably going to be observant and wise. Is it the obvious thing to do? Yeah, but more importantly, it's intuitive because we as humans have come to associate owls with being observant and wise. Animal people are an interesting topic in this conversation, however, because when they're done lazily, they almost have completely different symptoms of that laziness than do the alt-human types. The first and probably most egregious problem with animal people is when they are stereotypes, generally. Well guys, I just made a group of animal people. They're a poor reflection of African cultures that I didn't research and don't understand, but I think you'll like them anyway. Well, it's not impossible to make it work, and using that sort of thing for humor is probably the better route to go. I find that animal people work significantly less when the main draw for their attitudes and culture is the culture of the real-life people that said animal just happens to live around in real life, rather than the attributes that the culture they live around has given to them. It's an important distinction. That's to say, if you have elephant people, you might make something more interesting if you research how those cultures that live around elephants have characterized them and use that characterization as a basis. It'll not only be more fitting for them as elephants in all likelihood, but it also might not have weird implications. The next problem that comes around with animal people is that they don't tend to work as protagonists, at least not prospective protagonists, most of the time. Unfortunately, that's because of that big R word that you can never escape from. Relatability strikes again. Some people will be there for reading the perspective of a crocodile man. Some people will see that concept and not even give it a second look. Don't let that stop you, but you do have to be careful when you're writing from the perspective of an animal person, because sometimes when people do that, they don't compensate for that fact very well. And it can even get to a point where the reader might forget that the character they're reading is supposed to be an animal person, and sometimes it just makes for odd moments in the prose. And it is mostly a prose problem. I think it happens less if it's a visual medium, but there have been a few workshops I've been in where I've seen the animal qualities of the protagonist either basically not get mentioned at all, or they get mentioned so much that it starts to get annoying when every other line is about how the deer person's antlers clack on every door frame they walk through or whatever. I haven't written from the perspective of an animal person, so I don't have any personal experiences or wisdom to bestow upon thee in that sense, but it is something you should be aware of. I could go on to harp back onto that believability point in regards to animal people from earlier in the video, but I do think that the importance of whether it makes sense that there are animal people in your world really depends on how hard or soft your world building is. If it's softer, such things probably won't demand explaining, but if it's a harder world and there are alpine ibex people amongst an otherwise completely human population, you might have to work on making that make some sense. Oh, and last point about animal people, make sure they have thumbs, because otherwise you're gonna have problems. Anyway, that brings us to part 3, aliens. Now, here I mean aliens in two different senses. The first is fantasy creatures that are just such mishmashes of physical features that they stop being animal people and start just being something else, and actual honest-to-God aliens, so I can actually have something to say specifically for you sci-fi writers out there, because I know I neglect you a little bit. When it comes to the first sense of an alien, the so weird it's no longer an animal and it's not previously a mythological creature, I think that archetype is pretty cool, especially when they're done right. And this might be very basic advice, but one of the best places to look for designs like these and get inspiration is Star Wars, particularly the original movies. A lot of these glup shittos only get seen once or twice, but someone somewhere out there has written half a book about them on a wiki. Now, you might say, but J-Bat, why are you talking about Star Wars creatures as fantasy creatures and not sci-fi? Because Star Wars is a fantasy story with a space aesthetic. There's not very much science in Star Wars, at least not at its core, at its inception. Also, because this is my channel and I can do what I want, here's me ringing the Go Watch Andor bell. It's practically the only good Star Wars to come out since Disney took over the franchise, and it itself is actually sci-fi and thus tangentially relevant to the point at hand. Anyway, these more alien creatures in fantasy settings are often not defined as such just by their strange appearance, but also by their origin. The origin of fantasy creatures can be basically anything, but alien archetypes tend to be against the grain of whatever the established norm is for the setting, whatever that norm might be. Take, for example, Warhammer Fantasy's Lizardmen. They, and mostly their big frog overlords, are also essentially the alien archetype alongside the animal person archetype, because the old ones, a group of aliens, came down on magic spaceships and uplifted them to fight chaos. It's a very normal world. As for writing those actual honest-to-God aliens, I find the way a sci-fi story handles its aliens is done wrong very often, to the point that this alone is one of the reasons that I sometimes am not that big on sci-fi. Aliens can fall into any of the traps that fantasy races can too, more or less, but there are a few other things to be aware of. The overwhelmingly biggest problem that aliens have in sci-fi is that they are silly, basically, and not treated appropriately to the way that they are actually going to be received. This guy is not scary. There is nothing you can do to make him scary or get taken seriously. He's just a little gray gremlin guy. Look at him. Many people have realized this and thus made aliens that look weirder. Sometimes these designs are incredible. Sometimes they come off very silly. But what you need to keep in mind when designing an alien is that, with the exception of that odd story in which the alien is actually the more primitive species compared to human, as opposed to being more advanced or a peer, which is obviously way more common, is that this creature needs to have independently developed technology that modern man cannot conceive of. They should be at least as intelligent, if not way more so, than the average human. and that single thing is where the problems often start. In part, it's because of that old adage that a character is only as smart as their writer is, but also because when writing these sorts of characters, a truly brilliant yet alien intelligence, making them feel that way requires a lot of work. Sure, you can just make them work like humans, but then I feel you might be losing the unique potential that aliens offer you as a concept. Aliens should be alien. They should feel like something we can't quite understand. Something that operates fundamentally at least a bit differently to us. Especially in cases where aliens are antagonistic towards humans, you need to compare them and figure out how, if such will be the case, humanity will win against them at the end of the day. Some defer to human irrationalities as our strength, our emotions, our perseverance, our willingness to do things for others, even at hazard to ourselves. It's often these heroic human qualities that contrast a more cold, calculating alien. This is where I find that these dynamics are at their strongest, and even completely inverting that idea could be a lot of fun. But where aliens completely shatter and fall apart is when they're stupid. Audiences already hate when bad guys are stupid for no reason, but it's always worse with aliens. Because by their very existence in the story, we intuitively know that they should be intelligent. So every time an alien makes a stupid mistake, it's going to be significantly more egregious. And really, that's it. Just do not make your alien stupid unless you have a very good reason to do so. And make a point of thinking outside the box. There are a lot of things you can do with aliens that you just can't really do with other fictional creatures, and you would do well to play into that. But that brings us into our final category, part 4, constructs. Now, most often, when I say construct, you're going to think of literal machines. But depending on your definition, even, say, divine or infernal entities can be constructs, angelic or demonic avatars sent down to enforce the will of beings beyond mortality. By the way, sci-fi people, exchange a lot of what I'm about to say about constructs with the word robot. Machines do still apply to everything I'm about to say, but constructs are, by their title alone, artificial. They were not born, they were made, and that is a defining part of their existence that you really should play up. And in almost every case, said construct will know this about themselves. Though if they aren't aware about that, there is a lot of potential to do interesting stuff with that. Constructs are pretty common throughout speculative fiction, be they fantasy or sci-fi constructs, and when done lazily, they have almost universally the same problems. I could probably make a whole video about how people do artificial life poorly, but we'll start here. You can, in most cases, prevent the things that make constructs work poorly in your narrative by really thinking through the exact purpose of the construct's existence from their in-universe creator's mind. Say we have an angelic guardian sent down to protect someone that is destined to become important later in their life. What exact qualities should that guardian have? What would their divine machinist have intended for them? What are the limits of what they can do with this guardian, and what is prioritized in their creation? It's almost a given for construct-type characters to be robotic in personality, but that doesn't have to be the case. Think of replicants from Blade Runner, designed to be exactly the opposite of robotic. They're so close to indistinguishable from human that there's an entire type of cop designed specifically to identify them. Replicants were constructs made to not be construct-like. Take our angelic guardian example. A lazy way of doing it might look like the guardian being essentially entirely silent and doing very little but to physically defend its charge from attacks. It's not a bad setup per se, but don't you see that there's more potential that you could do with that? What if the guardian was aware of its duty and rather talkative? What if they don't like the person they've been sent to guard? That'd be fun. And while you do then give yourself the question of why are they allowed to not like the person they've been sent to guard, at least then you're solving a question spawned out of doing something interesting, which is always a better type of problem to have than a problem spawned out of not doing something interesting. And if we're going more in the artificial intelligence AI direction for sci-fi stories, here the question comes mostly down to the fact that they are done poorly when the writer doesn't have a stance on where that AI actually places in sentience relative to humans. Star Wars' droids are basically just metallic people with some funny quirks here and there, and that works for that kind of story. But even though replicants are also basically just people, they obviously do not feel the same as Star Wars droids, because Star Wars droids are an aesthetic addition to the setting, a good one, but you're not meant to think about them that much. Whereas in Blade Runner, the entire point of the story is the replicants. When someone writes a robot and they have quirky, dry humor because they're a robot, guys, and they just sort of know everything, it doesn't always hit as true. AI is a super relevant topic nowadays. Everyone has a stance on it, and you'll have to take one in your writing in order to make any artificial characters feel right and feel authentic. And honestly, with that, I feel we've basically covered the archetypes of lazily built fantasy and sci-fi races. There's plenty more to say on the topic, but I think this was an okay overview. In either case, I hope you have enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts of your own about being cultured, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way. We also have a Discord if you would want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner, Sonny, and Isaac Parrott, our Knights of the Inner Circle, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, the Borks are my idea. Don't steal.